Well, hello, everybody. We're going to be talking today about a really important concept in really just world culture and history of thought, but definitely having direct bearing on literature as well. That concept is the idea of the great chain of being. And it's really a cultural concept that is important in later literature. So it's good to know this to kind of frame what's going on in a lot of literature and just culture in general. The time period we're talking about in particular is well, to a certain extent, all the way from, say, like the 400s BC, but really getting going in, say, around the 1 to 200s AD through to it still has a major impact up till like the late 1700s, although there are some changes over time, and we're going to be talking about that. All right, so first of all, kind of some background to the concept. Well, of course, we've got Plato and Aristotle here. So Plato there, that's the fellow at the top. Aristotle, the statue at the bottom that's partly obscured by my face. Um, So we've talked about Plato a little bit. We read Plato's cave, Allegory of the Cave from his Republic. And one thing, it talked about the whole shadows on the walls and stuff like that. And one thing that's important for what we're talking about here is those shadows were an example of, the turning from the shadows to reality, all illustrated, at least in part, Plato's idea of the theory of forms. So Plato argues that because the things we come across in daily life, they don't perfectly provide perfect examples really for the things that we consider them. Like, for example, you have circles, and we've seen a lot of circles, but we've never seen a perfect circle. However, we seem to somehow have a concept of a perfect circle. So Plato argues that there must be some sort of like form of circularity which is above and beyond any individual circular anything. And things like mathematical concepts and stuff like that. And then ultimately, he thought that all of those ranked back to something he called the good, which was the basically the form of all forms and stuff like that. And he sees that things in existence sort of kind of receive their forms from these forms that exist outside of any individual physical thing. So, a form of flatness is instantiated to a small and to a certain degree, although limited and imperfect, by, say, a table, a tabletop being flat and stuff like that. And he sees that forms are really the ultimate truth that we're seeking for, um, that we only kind of imperfectly see through physical objects and actions and such in our world. So, for example, I don't think this is Plato himself, but other philosophers mentioned that anything I have to say about an object by its own nature uses kind of these more larger abstract qualities. Like I say, the chair is blue. Well, both that idea chair and blue are independent of any individual chair. They're categories that sort of transcend any individual chair, but I'm combining those two sort of categories, those two things, to talk about this individual chair, and that sort of thing. All right. And so he sees the forms as being like more truly true than the things that they instantiate, because the forms can still, exist. Like chairness as a category still exists, even though this individual chair will eventually break down and such. All right, so his most famous student, Aristotle, carries forward some of those ideas while also rather famously disagreeing with his teacher on some others. So Aristotle argues that forms don't really have this independent existence per se floating around, like there's not like this realm of the form of chairness, but that he does agree that everything that we see does have a twofold nature, like it's the nature of what it's made out of, and then the form that stuff is put into. So another way of saying that is hylomorphism. That's just a fancy Greek word that consists literally of two parts. Hule and morphe. Hule is basically the Greek word for stuff, just kind of matter or stuff or that sort of thing, and morphe for form. So it's kind of like form stuff is what hylomorphism means. And that's really one of Aristotle's main contributions to thought. So he argues that, for instance, like the chair I'm looking at right now over here in my classroom, it's made out of plastic and metal. Okay, so that's the stuff that it's made out of. But it doesn't mean it's the same thing as just a random heap of plastic and metal. There's also something additional added, which is a form. And he argues that you never come across physical objects that, and interact with them that don't have both those things. They don't have both form and matter. The stuff they're made out of and then the form in which it's shaped. Even a random heap of plastic and metal still has, the form of a heap, if you will. So he argues that all reality is that we come across is a mixture of form and matter, but also of actuality and potentiality. So, for example, that plastic resin waiting to be extruded into the chair shape is potentially a chair, but it doesn't become in actuality a chair till it becomes squeezed into chair shape. And even then, it can never completely go into actuality. It still contains potential, because it will potentially eventually one day break down, and also that it could potentially be reshaped into something else, so that all items carry with them form and matter, and then also potentiality and actuality, and with varying levels of that potentiality being actualized. And he argues that this means that we can rank beings in some way by form and function, so that some beings have more potentiality realized of, like the underlying matter, more of the underlying matter's potentiality in different ways is being realized in different things and among different beings. And he also argues that this leads to a sort of hierarchical ranking, with the things with more actuality being somewhat more highly ranked than others, and also that there's a proper order of all beings. And when things are in their proper order, we have harmony, and when they're out of order, we have strife. So all of this stuff by Plato and Aristotle really goes into this later concept of the great chain of being. But we're going to talk about a couple other thinkers that really kick it up to the next level and start the process of forming this idea. So the next one is the most important philosopher you've never heard of, Plotinus. So I'm not saying that, maybe you have heard of him, but a lot of people have never heard of this guy, but he's hugely influential. Basically, the entire history of philosophy since him has been profoundly shaped by him, as well as really the entire history of Jewish, Islamic, and Christian thought has been deeply shaped by Plotinus's ideas. And thus, of course, all the other thought and philosophy that's come out of those cultures as well. So Plotinus is the founder of a school known as Neoplatonism. And he takes the idea of Plato's, this idea of the good being the form above all forms, if you will, and also Aristotle's idea of, realities consists of form and matter together, hylomorphism. And Plotinus takes that idea of kind of a hierarchical ordering that I mentioned in Aristotle much further, and combines it with Plato's idea of the good, which he kicks up to another level, and he says basically, he calls it the one, that basically being is not something that exists equally in all things, that some things in some ways have more being, or as Aristotle might say, more actualized being than others. So he would argue that, say, like a human has more being in some ways actualized than a heap of dust, because a human has a more definite form as well as the ability to reason and things like that. And so you have these orders of good. And he argues that everything emanates from the source of creation, which he calls the one. And he doesn't believe that, when I say source of creation, he doesn't believe like there was a time that everything came into being. He thinks that this is like something that always exists, that everything is always, in some ways, emanating from this source of being he calls the one. He uses the example of, say, a sun with its rays going out, so that's why we have that little image right up there of the sun with its rays. He argues that the sun with its rays going out is a really potent picture of, the idea of the one, that, in some ways, everything hit by the sun's rays is interacting with and is kind of part of the sun, and those rays as they go out, but they become more attenuated and, as they go out into the void of nothingness. So he argues that all things have within them, being, but it's a dependent sort of properties, just kind of like, the picture that's on my screen is dependent upon the electricity coming to my computer. And it's dependent upon, say, the physical laws of electricity and light and things like that, for that image to appear. So the image itself is a dependent reality on those other realities. So he argues that all reality is ultimately dependent on what he calls the one. And so once again, he argues this idea of these orders of good, that, a pile of dust isn't bad necessarily. It's not like its existence is evil. It's not like an evil substance or something, but it contains less good than that of a human being. So if you were to reduce a human being to a pile of dust, you have done evil in the sense that you have reduced the great good of the human being to the lesser good of the pile of dust. And so therefore he sees evil as not like an actual thing, but rather as a privation of good, that a loss of some higher goodness for some lower goodness. And so when we get into the medieval era, and Augustine's really more of a late antique writer than a medieval writer, but he really founds a lot of what medieval thought happens in the 400s. And so Augustine takes Plotinus's ideas and he basically says, okay, what Plotinus, who was a pagan, he was not a Christian, but what Plotinus said, Plotinus is the one, is more or less what we mean by God, although he tweaks some ideas. Plotinus believed the universe was eternal, and he says, no, it came into being at a particular time, but that this idea of the one, the being upon which all other beings depend, that is God himself. Because keep in mind that the Greeks, their idea of gods were much more kind of like almost like a Superman figure than, say, this idea of this foundational being good or something. And so with Christian thought, that idea of the very source of being becomes, the idea of God. Aquinas later pulls in a lot of Aristotelian thought and elaborates a lot of what Augustine and Plotinus had first put out, and later on in the 1200s and all, and so develops some of these ideas further and classifies them and kind of puts them into new forms and relations to each other and such. So all of the above, like I said, really Plotinus you could kind of call the originator of this idea of the great chain of being, very much dependent on Plato and Aristotle, but he's in many ways the originator of it. But this very much gets elaborated and continued more with ideas of Augustine and Aquinas. So now we're going to go ahead and look at what that model itself kind of sees as the nature of the world. Okay, so the idea of the great chain of being is that all being is sort of ordered in this chain of having more being and more existence to less being and less existence. So according to this theory, at the very top of the chain, really the, kind of not exactly part of the chain, but really the force behind the entire idea of the chain of being and everything is God. And then you'd see angels ranked below God, humans ranked below angels, animals below humans, plants below animals, and minerals below plants. And then at the very bottom, you'd have stuff like just dust, which is not, doesn't even have like the form of, say, a diamond, which is a mineral, let alone some of the other things that things higher in the chain are. Kind of outside of the chain, well, not really outside of the chain, but kind of out of their proper place and causing problems would be things like fallen angels and humans who don't or rebel against their place in the great chain of being. And so when everything is all in proper order, this creates harmony and justice and decency. But, fallen angels, rebellious humans, stuff like that have the ability to kind of knock things out of their proper order and cause chaos and such. So we're going to look at some of the different elements of this idea of the great chain of being one by one as we go forward and discuss what they mean. But you can see here in this illustration, this is like I believe made during the Renaissance, probably. It looks like it's an engraving that was printed. So you have God at the top, and you have this chain of being down to the very bottom, where you have, kind of below this chain of being, you have like Satan and the devils and stuff like that. But you see, this is things like minerals and stuff, and then you have plants, and you have animals, you have maybe higher animals, and you have humans, and you have angels and stuff like that, all the way up the chain to God himself. So a very popular way of looking at the world. And I say very popular. This is basically the way that it's going to be foundational to the way that anybody who's a writer, really from the 400s on to some extent, but definitely from the 1200s on to pretty much the 1800s, some concept like this is going to underlie the way pretty much any writer in the Western tradition is going to be seeing the world. Okay, so talking about individual elements. God. So God is not strictly speaking according to this idea of the great chain of being, and really according to most philosophers from, at least the 1 or 200s onwards. They did not conceive of God as a being per se. Like, okay, here's a planet over here, here's a tree over here, and there's God over there. Okay, so now when I say that, they did have ideas of the gods, but even most of the pagans in antiquity, they were losing the idea of the gods as completely separate sort of beings. They more saw most of the educated pagans from at least like the 100s or so on would, if you asked them philosophically what they believed about the gods, they'd say, well, there really is only one God, but we just have like all these different sort of ways of understanding him, like, okay, Zeus as being powerful, or Venus as being love, and stuff like that. And they would have seen those more as kind of like lesser conceptions of God or stuff like that. Then, of course, with the Christians and then and the Jews, and then later on the Muslims, they would have thought of God as ultimately there only being one God. But anyway, this concept of God was the idea of not a being, but rather being itself. So we wouldn't say so much God exists as God is existence. So underlying everything that exists from moment to moment is the very concept of existence itself, which they would argue was synonymous with God. So God being existence means that everything else that exists in a relation to God, we're of complete dependence. So more than seeing God like the watchmaker God, who makes the watch, winds it up, sets it to the side, but the watch is something completely separate being from the guy who makes the watch, it would be closer to the relationship between, say, a musician and the song he's playing. So God would be kind of in this concept like the musician, and existence itself, like everything else that exists, being kind of the song played. So the song doesn't continue existing without there being someone playing it, at least not in actuality. We might say it consists in a concept in people's minds or notes written down on a page, but it's not existing in reality outside of the person playing it. And so the idea of God being the source of all existence is that idea that he underlies existence at a very intimate level. And it's also this idea of divine simplicity. And what that means is that God is not ultimately made up of different parts, that ultimately God is one completely in being, and that and even Christians who believe in the Trinity still believe that God was one completely in being. Just the idea of the Trinity was an idea of relations within that one being. So you couldn't say separate out God's existence from his love or his justice, that ultimately we speak of those things as separate, but that's because we can only see things conceptually like one at a time. But ultimately in God, they are actually all the same thing. God's existence is his love, which is his justice and all that sort of thing. And what that comes down to in practicality is this idea of negative theology. And that doesn't mean theology about bad stuff, but it means that basically we can't know God per se, but we can know what God isn't. We can know that he isn't a, limited being. We can know that he isn't, a waterfall. He isn't a this, he isn't a that. And that ultimately all we can know about God is by analogy, that, okay, he's a little bit like a waterfall and that he's powerful and overwhelming. He's a little bit like the sun and that, he's the source of all life and light in the universe. But he's also not like the same thing as any of those things. So we can just speak of kind of like this, but also very much not like that as well. And so God is not really in this chain of beings. He's really the being itself that underlies the entire chain in this conception. Okay, so next one, we're going to talk about angels. Okay, so they do not believe that angels are physical. And when I say that, and here I'm speaking more specifically about Christian theology because there's a lot of variation in Jewish theology, which could be kind of all over the place on that question, and Muslim theology possibly as well. But in Christian theology, angels were seen very specifically as non-physical. And what that does not mean is that they were some sort of like misty something. It means quite literally they're not even a misty something. They are non-physical, that they could show up, like their effects could show up in the physical world. Just like when I put in the proper calculations, I add stuff together, we see a proper instantiation of 2 apples plus 2 apples makes 4 apples, something like that. So angels could, say, appear to humans perhaps, but that appearance was just that. That wasn't the angel. The angel was a non-physical reality that underlay the appearance and what kind of like cast the appearance, sort of like a shadow into the world. What that means also in theory is that according to Aquinas, every angel is a different type of being. So there's, we call them angels because they're like non-physical beings and we classify them that way, but every one was specifically different. Wasn't like that there was a species called human, like the species called human, then there's individuals, but every angel was almost like its separate species. So there's this whole complex hierarchy of angels being, from differing levels, and they are seen as having a will and an intellect and stuff like that, although no physical being. The idea of, there being this plentitude that basically every possible thing that could exist, every possible type of angel would actually exist. And so this idea of millions upon billions of angels, and you wouldn't really say everywhere because as they're not physical, they don't actually exist in a particular space any more than, say, 2 + 2 exists in a particular place or space. And then, of course, there's the idea of fallen angels, which are angels that rebelled against God and therefore are also shaping physical reality, but in kind of a malign and an evil sort of way, mostly by messing with people's imaginations and such. All right, our next one down is the one with which we're most familiar, humans. Okay, humans are seen as particularly interesting in this model because humans have, obviously, physical nature, physical bodies that are pretty central to who we are. We have an animal nature. We eat, drink, reproduce, do those sorts of things pretty much in the same way that animals do, at least from a basic physical sense. And we can die, just like animals do, and we do die. However, at the same time, we have this ability to rationally think, which they argued was not just merely a physical ability. We can think about stuff that transcends physical reality. We can come up with concepts that outlive ourselves. We're able to have a direct connection to God in a way that, in a relational way that an animal, they would argue, could not have. An animal could be, obviously has their existence from God, but couldn't really have a concept of God per se, and a desire to enter into relationship with God. So they see humans as kind of the bridge, if you will, between the world of this more abstract world of thought and being, and then the physical reality as well. Although they don't really see those as completely separate realms, they see them as very much interpenetrated. This idea of dualism between the world of the mind and thought and the world of physical reality that's really doesn't come in till later. This is more of an idea of gradations of being, with non-physical reality, some being at a higher level, but ultimately still within that same chain. All right, and then humans also have the ability to, since they can reason like angels, they can also disobey God like angels could. So we're going to now talk about the next links on the chain below human. So we have, and we're kind of flipping the script here because we're kind of going from bottom up now, from minerals to plants to animals. And the argument for how we could kind of rank these beings, if you will, is that each rank above has all of the stuff that the rank below has, plus something new within these realities. So, for example, minerals, they exist, so they have that good of existence. Because remember, they keep in mind this is from Plotinus' idea that all that exists is good. So they have the good of existence, and they also have the good of having some sort of form. So, like a diamond is, it has a particular diamond form. A sheet of mica has a particular sheet of mica form. They do not, however, have life. So they have being, form, but no life. Plants, next rung up, they have being, they exist, so that goodness. They have form. Well, that tree has a particular shape that it goes into that's like particular to that type of tree. But then they also have life. And we know that that's an additional thing because when a plant has the ability to die. So we know that that thing is something separate from its being and form. We could say it's connected to its form to a certain extent, but yeah. So it has being, a definite form, but also some element of form called life, this interaction that's going on in there. And they wouldn't necessarily even make much of an attempt to argue what type of thing life was necessarily. I mean, they did make those arguments, but they'd say it wouldn't really matter. Whatever it is, we know that it's something that a rock doesn't have. And then animals, being, form, life, and consciousness. And we know that they have consciousness in a way that, say, a tree doesn't, because, well, I could knock a dog unconscious, but I can't knock an oak tree unconscious. So we know that since there's something lost with that consciousness, and, what do we call a creature that is supposed to have consciousness that doesn't? Or sometimes what we call humans? Maybe not the nicest word, but we do sometimes call them vegetable when they have no consciousness. So yeah, you can see kind of that even in our language. However, they argued that animals didn't really have the ability to reason and think conceptually and abstractly like humans. Okay, So here is those links on the chain. And they even made arguments within these individual things, like, that minerals, like a diamond was a higher form than, say, a lump of coal, even though it has the same, basic substance. Diamond has a different form, and so that form elevates it higher. Um, because it is a much harder mineral, so it holds its form more strongly than, say, coal, which is crumbly and that sort of thing. And so is less likely to hold any fixed form for as long. Okay, so now we're going to talk about kind of what happened to that model and why it declined and was replaced. So there's some changes in the 1600s. Aristotle gets challenged a lot on his science because he was wrong on a lot of his science. And that opens the door to questioning a lot of the other things that depended on his thought, like, for instance, the idea of the great chain of being, as well as some other thinkers and the scholastics and such like that. And so a very major figure in this is the French philosopher René Descartes. That's this guy right here. Probably his best known thing is, if you ever heard cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am. That's straight from Descartes. But Descartes has this idea, instead of this, like gradations of being, from more being to less being, that basically all that exists in two forms, instead of this infinite gradation, that there is matter and then there is mind, and that everything is kind of exists in one side or the other. That humans cross that boundary, that we have mind and we have also matter. And it was a real problem in his philosophy as to, well, how do those two interact in a human? He actually argued that the pineal gland in the brain was where the interaction took place. But, that theory got discounted pretty quickly and such. But the importance of it is the idea of this mechanistic universe. So basically, that things are just kind of stuff. That, the solar system just kind of acts like this great big machine. Animals are basically really complicated machines. And you can see, kind of how that's coming into being right around the time when machines are becoming more and more important. And we have these complicated stuff like, watches and clocks and things like that. You have also this idea of the idea of heliocentrism, which kind of dethrones the Earth. I'd say dethrones it, although the medieval thought was really that the Earth was at the bottom of the universe, not really so much at the center of importance, but that like the higher you got away from the Earth, the more refined and sort of decent and perfect things became. Whereas, you have in Dante's Inferno, the very center of the Earth is quite literally Satan's butt. I'm not kidding. That's what it has in Dante's Inferno. So then you go outwardly in concentric circles and stuff like that. But still, you have this idea of this very ordered universe, which heliocentrism seems to kind of knock out of its place. And so it kind of upsets some of these ideas of hierarchy and all that were tied into that idea of the great chain of being. But there's still a lot of elements that are still maintained after Descartes and sort of the philosophical revolution that he in many ways starts. So, for instance, they still kept the idea of the properly ordered society being a hierarchical ranking of, humans being above animals and animals above plants and stuff like that. So they kept some ideas of this hierarchical ranking, although this idea of each rank having more being than the last, that kind of goes away with Cartesian dualism, where instead of all these, gradations of existence, it's more just mind and matter as these two separate categories. Really, what puts the end completely to this idea of the great chain of being is the Romantic movement. The great chain of being had become implicated in a lot of politics at the time, where, the king, everything, the king is at the top, and then the nobles, and then, stuff like that. And so they saw that as kind of a parallel to this great chain of being. And when Romanticism very much questions that idea of there being kind of this natural order, it really messes up a lot of the concepts of Cartesian, not Cartesian dualism, of the great chain of being and such. And we see this shift away from it. And also this different conception of matter and chaos, because the Romantics tend to see sort of form as kind of arising organically from some sort of something within matter itself, rather than having, matter and form being always united, but sort of separate concepts and such. So you have a very kind of a shift away from all the things that held up this thought, and so it really falls apart in the Romantic movement at the end of the 1700s, beginning of the 1800s. All right, so some implications of this idea of ranked. All things exist in a hierarchy, and so they believe they can classify things by ranking. So, humans above animals, but some animals above others. So usually at the top of the animal hierarchy, they'd have something like a lion or an elephant, because they're very large, powerful. They eat the other things lower on the chain, in the case of the lion, or can stomp them into mud, according to the elephant, because it's quite literally the biggest land animal, and stuff like that. So diamonds as seen as kind of the primate or the highest form of the mineral category, because, well, they're the hardest, and so they hold their form the most steadily and such. Also, this idea of the proper spheres of things, that, this goes back to the heliocentrism, that, Earth belonged at the lowest place, then water above Earth, then air above water, and then fire above that. This is kind of the whole four elements theory, which actually way predates the Great Chain of Being, goes back to the Greek philosophers. And so everything was always trying to get to its proper place. So if you pour water on the land, it tends to stay on top of the land, but it also tends to try to go downwards to find the lowest place on the land possible, while it stays above the land. And then air, if you open up an air bubble underwater, it wants to get above the water, because they saw it as much more sort of a internal, almost drive within that type of matter that would lead it to its proper place. If I light a match, the flame goes upwards, like it's trying to go up above the air, and so they argued that the true place of flame was above that. And then a lot of times they would argue that there was some fifth matter called quintessence, which was even more refined than flame, but only existed in the outside universe, because, when they look at stuff, like, say, the planets and stuff, we all know that the planets do kind of alter over time, but in the time scales that they're looking at with the equipment, they don't see any alteration, so it seems perfect and unchanging. And so they argue it has to be something even more refined than fire, some sort of perfect matter. Obviously, there's political implications. The idea of, it gets implied that, there is a proper political order too. And when everything's in its proper order, then we have harmony. You can see some of the issues that come into the theory there and why it gets rejected partly later on. And so, once again, other implications are when everything's in its proper order, we have harmony. When angels become proud and try to take God's place, they fall out of their proper order, and then they cause chaos. And they cause problems in the order by, affecting the physical world in ways that are evil and destructive. Humans can fall out of their proper order in both directions. They can think that they're higher than they are and fall prey to pride, and thus, hubris and all the kinds of things that cause. But they can also sink below their proper order and behaving, irrationally like an animal, if you will. So just letting their, lust or their hunger or something like that kind of cloud their reason, so that they aren't behaving truly in their place as a human, as a rational reasoning being, but they're behaving more animalistically. So like getting drunk or something like that, they would argue is becoming animalistic, because you're deliberately just decreasing your God-given ability to reason and that sort of thing. And so they believe that the fall of man, like the sin of Adam and Eve and everything that, they would have seen as the kind of root of all things evil, was basically a falling out of proper order, and thus leading to disharmony all throughout the creative world, where everything else kind of starts rebelling against who are supposed to be their leaders, they're humans, because the humans aren't in their proper relationship before, and so everything else just kind of gets out of kilter. And so the proper society is one where, as much as possible, which they didn't believe it was ever completely possible, because since the fall they saw humans as flawed, but as much as possible restrains things, encourages humans to behave rationally, and all that kind of stuff. So implications in literature. This idea of the proper spheres is really important. So for instance, you'll see in Hamlet, someone says that, lose their reason, without which we are mere beasts. Because the idea is when we fall out of our proper order and we behave like animals, or we get too proud, then it can cause huge, profound upsets in society. So, and that sort of thing. The conflict between animal and rational natures, since we're both rational and animal, when we give way too much, when we become we forget our animality, if you will, then we lose our place, and we become too abstracted and stuff like that, and we lose connection to the world. Or if we give too much way to our animal side, then we fall out of that proper place. Symbolism that's associated with particular beings. That's associated with particular beings, where you have beings that are seen as out of their proper order. And then you also have these weird liminal beings, kind of like elves and fairies, that sometimes crop up that don't quite seem to fit in any category, and that always kind of have this uncomfortable place because they don't know quite where to fit them. And then you have, once again, this idea of order and hierarchy that shows up in literature a lot. And chaos in literature is usually associated with something getting out of its proper place in the chain. Anyway, so all of that is kind of gives you an overall feeling for what this idea of the great chain of being is. And so we will talk about this some more in class, and I will see you all later. Have a good one.